So, hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining our Friday Secular Speaker Series, aka Rage Friday. And on this Friday, February 28th, 2025, I hope you're all participating in the economic blackout action that's happening today all over the world. Feel free to put in the chat what economic acts of resistance you're participating in. Also, be sure to change the settings from host and panelists to everyone so we can all borrow your acts of resistance. Next week, starting tomorrow, actually, we have a big week. Tomorrow at the Melrose Street Fair, we're going to be on 7th Avenue, somewhere near Turney Avenue, so find us there. On Tuesday, March 4th, I'll be participating in a protest and speaking at the Capitol. On Wednesday evening, March 5th, we have a private fundraiser with Seth Andrews, the Thinking Atheist. That's going to be a great event. So I'm sure everybody's putting links in there right now. And on Thursday, March 6th, we have our annual day at the Capitol. So lots of things are coming up, and we all need to do our best to stay involved at whatever capacity we're able to. But for today, we are speaking to Hilary Wething. She is an economist at the Economic Policy Institute. Her research examines the relationship between labor market policy, household economic security, and social safety net programs. Prior to joining EPI as an economist, Wething was an assistant professor of public policy at the Pennsylvania State University School of Public Policy. She holds a Ph.D. in public policy and management with concentrations in demography and economics from the Daniel J. Evans School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Washington. Wething has undergraduate degrees in mathematics and economics from Creighton University. So she sounds like just the kind of person that committee chairs at the Arizona State Legislature would completely disregard for their expertise. So we are in great company today, folks. Hi, Hilary.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. It's just such a really cool organization, and I'm so grateful to, be able to spend an hour with you all today and talk a little bit about some of my more recent education research. Um, I'm going to share my screen, and we'll get started. Just to kind of prep folks for what I'm going to do today, I do have a slideshow prepared that's, I think, like somewhere between 15 and 25 minutes, depending on how long I talk, and how many questions I get in between. And then I'm going to show you a tool that I created online. My hope is that by showing this tool to you, you'll be able to potentially use it in, your policy fights in Arizona. I'll probably try not to babble on for too much longer than 25 minutes, and then I'll show you this tool, and then I'll just pause and we can all chat and have a conversation about education policy. So I will share my screen. Can we confirm that we are seeing the screen?
Yes, it looks great.
Okay, cool. Since I've come to EPI, I've mostly focused on education policy. And one of the things that I kind of learned about very quickly is the just insane problem that school vouchers pose as a threat to public education in our country. Let's see. I'm just going to give a very brief history of what that means. And for those of you who are like, what are vouchers? I've never heard of this. This is basically public financing of private education. Arizona in particular is a really great place to give this talk because I'm sure you all are actually pretty familiar with vouchers. You have a very, very mature voucher program in your state. So I'll just give a very brief history and kind of state of play in the policy world, and then some economic intuition behind vouchers. I'll then do just sort of go over what we know about how vouchers do or do not work in terms of their purported goal of improving educational achievement. And then I'm going to walk through a recent piece we did that tried to document one of the costs of vouchers. There are many costs of vouchers. I will not go into all of them, but we were able to kind of carve out a narrow slice. And so I'll spend the bulk of my time talking about that. I should say, please, as questions come up, I am totally open to answering any clarifying questions. And for bigger questions, we'll talk about those at the end. But I'm very happy to have this be more of a dialogue as we move through it than just me chatting. Okay, so school vouchers have been around actually for a long time. Beginning in the 50s, following the Brown versus Board of Education ruling, many Southern states used vouchers as a tool to undermine integration efforts. They often were kind of public financing for parents of white children to afford segregated white private schools. So they've been around for a while. In the 1990s, a more kind of modern incarnation of them came to the stage. And these had the claim of supporting either students who were coming from low-income neighborhoods or students with disabilities. These were intended to be small, targeted voucher programs. And in 2000, just 11,000 students were using them. More recently, kind of over the last 25 years, legislation has broadened both the applicant pool for vouchers and what they can be used for. And so today, as a result of that broadening, the number of students enrolled is over 600,000 in our country. These more sort of universal programs are basically, we can think of as almost, they're not quite, but they're pretty close to a blank check for a student to take that and leave their public school, or if they're already attending private school, take that check and use it to put forward towards their private school or homeschooling education. Just so you can kind of see what is happening currently, I have some numbers. 31 states with voucher programs are currently existing in the country, and 11 states have universal programs. So these are not just happening in Arizona, they're throughout the country. The orange is the universal, and so you see Arizona has a very substantial universal voucher program. But there's a trend here. They've been happening throughout the country, and this sort of trend towards universal programs continues to kind of beat the drum path in the country. And here I just pulled a really great tracker from Public Funds for Public Schools. And they are tracking voucher legislation this year, so for the 2025 legislative cycle. And you can see that there's voucher proposals, in many different states, in Montana, in North and South Dakota, Tennessee, Idaho. So the popularity of these continues to be introduced over and over again, often by Republican houses. Before I talk a little bit more about the impact of vouchers, being an economist, I sort of feel compelled to put on my economist hat and talk about why these don't make any economic sense. If this is not your thing, phase out, I'll be back in 2 minutes. But I think one of the things that really gets overlooked here is the claim that school choice proponents keep making is that education would be somehow improved if there was a private or market-like competition. So to just stop there and say, wait a second, should education be treated like a market good? In the US, actually, right now, we rightly mandate universal education. So in that universal mandate, we are basically kind of breaking market rules like 101. In the market, you can either opt in or opt out, and that voluntary component is part of the market exchange. Education is a universal right in this country. And so we already are sort of breaking the kind of economic logic that would make a solution like school choice a reasonable solution for the sort of problem, quote unquote, of certain schools not performing. The other thing that's kind of implicitly stated and that I think is worth just saying is wrong is, market competition requires goods to be interchangeable and for competitors to be easily accessible. So if I like my groceries and I, want to shop at a grocery store called Wegmans, and instead I'd rather go to ShopRite, I have my ability to do that and kind of at my choice. It's easy to get to both of those grocery stores. They're both within 2 miles of my home, and I can basically shop based on the prices or sales I want. That is not how public schools work. Public schools are not interchangeable. Switching schools, the idea of that I could just switch from one school to another is not the same as switching from a Whole Foods to a ShopRite. It's extraordinarily costly, both in time, administrative burden, and severed social networks. In certain areas, particularly rural areas, switching schools is actually impossible. There are no other choices. And so often this sort of language of school choice is a solution to a problem of, potentially underperforming public schools, which is what their kind of claim there is, isn't actually a solution available for many schools that might actually instead need more additional public funds to go to their public schools. The final thing just to bring up is that universal schooling, and I realize I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but universal schooling generates positive spillovers to society at large. There are benefits beyond just that student and teacher interaction or that student and government interaction. Whenever there are spillovers, so spillovers is an economic term to sort of say the benefits or costs that are beyond the single person in a transaction. So me being highly educated benefits, my community, my neighbors, my family, my friends. You all, being educated and attending this talk, you're going to share this information with your community. That kind of general spillover of education is not accounted for in a market model that school choice is trying to operate in. By school choice saying that, hey, we're just going to be like a market and offer more choices, we're not allowing for that spillover to actually kind of flourish. And we therefore are going to underinvest in education as a result. A second point that I think is sort of important to keep in mind around vouchers is that they really actually just don't improve educational outcomes. So again, proponents here kind of think like, well, we should be, for schools that aren't performing as well, we should be offering more choice, allowing these kids to attend different and better schools so that they can experience, higher educational achievement. The data and the research in that just doesn't bear it out. We see that test scores actually declined in Louisiana, Ohio, and Indiana following voucher program enactment. In Milwaukee, which has had voucher programs for around 25 years, 40% of private voucher schools have failed or closed down within the program's first 25 years. And nearly 20% of kids left voucher programs every year, most coming back to public school. So they're not really, among states that we've seen that have had voucher programs, they're not really even succeeding all that much. In Arizona, you've become famous in the news for your vouchers in particular being very, very expensive to state and local budgets. Arizona had a voucher proposal of around 33 million in the first year and 65 million in the second. And instead, that program ended up costing 587 million in the first year and upwards of 708 million in the second year. All is to say, these programs end up being way more expensive than they're intended, and they also are not necessarily delivering benefits to students. I'm just going to take a pause there and see if there are any questions that would be worth chatting about right now versus what we should study. What do you think?
Yeah, there's one that just came up. Has there been this is from Jay, I think. Has there been a rollback or elimination of state-funded school vouchers? And if so, what was the impact? So has any state ever rolled back vouchers?
There are a few states that are increasingly deeming them unconstitutional. I want to say that Tennessee or Kentucky might be in a fight about that right now, like in the last 2 years. So we haven't seen that the research on, like, we need a few more years basically of data to be able to figure out that impact. It's a great question though, because I think, Jay, that speaks to your knowledge that not just only are vouchers, kind of rapidly expanding, but, states that try them realize they're a disaster, will often try to rule them as unconstitutional or attempt to roll them back. And so I think probably in a few more years, when we have a little bit more data, we'll be able to do that research and get that information. We just don't know quite yet.
There is one more question here coming from Philip, and he's asking for Louisiana, Ohio, and Indiana, was the decline in test scores related to COVID, or is this test data from
This is before COVID.
before
All of these
COVID?
are pre-COVID.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A great question, though. We try our best to separate those two experiences so that we're not comparing kind of apples and oranges in terms of what the kids are going through. Yeah, all of those test scores were pre-COVID information. Final thing I'll say, and I kind of alluded to this, Jim, I love that you haven't heard the name Wegmans in years. Yeah, I'm on the East Coast, so there you go. Uh, there's a lot of research that shows how money in public education really does matter. And this is an important point, and I think one that sort of we think, okay, duh. However, there's been a lot of really great research in the last like 5 to 10 years that causally identified the impact of an additional $1,000 in public school funding on test scores using methods that kind of controlled for all the other noise. So they controlled for time, they controlled for different geographies, they controlled for the recessions, they controlled for different student demographics. And these kind of like causally identified studies did a really deep dive saying, okay, apples to apples, is an additional $1,000 or additional funding in public schools really make a difference? And they have found, and by they, I mean at least 7 or 8 studies at this point have found, yes, more money matters. And not only does it matter, it matters more for kids in low-income schools. And those kids tend to disproportionately do better as a result of strong funding for public schools. Why does this relate to vouchers, you might ask? Well, in general, the argument about vouchers is that public schools are quote unquote failing us. And I want us to just like take a beat there on that precedent. What is the information that public school is failing us that we should be able to judge that? One way that people are judging it is, maybe you see test scores or something like that, and you're saying, oh my God, the test scores are bad, and that means that the public school isn't working. The solution that school choice advocates are putting forward is saying, okay, this isn't working, you need a new school. I want to posit, based on this research, there's actually another solution. We could invest more into our public schools right now. And by doing that, that would allow public schools to pay teachers more. It would allow public schools to provide more intensive curriculum, support the sort of most disadvantaged students in their districts. And that actually might be a better solution based on the research than any of the research we've seen on school choice. Okay. The other thing, and this is sort of going towards the research that I've done recently at EPI, there's a bunch of different costs that vouchers generate. So I talked about a little bit with the Arizona example, how vouchers end up, quote, bloating budgets. The reason is there's several different costs that vouchers take on. Vouchers first have direct costs to state budgets. Now, states are publicly funding private education. For folks who are just like curious about who these students are, about 75% of the students that are taking up vouchers are not students that are leaving public ed, but students that are already enrolled in private education. So the state is now basically just picking up the tab for tuition for students who were already going to attend private school. That's a huge cost. They also have an indirect cost. And this is based on the indirect cost comes for students who are left in traditional public school systems in a state that has vouchers. That cost is the cost of maintaining the same level of education amidst declining enrollment from kids that might have left the public school to take that private school voucher. Just to talk about econ real quick, for those of you that had Econ 101, you'll remember this. An externality in economics produces an outcome for those who are otherwise not responsible for the decision at hand. So all of the CO2 that we have from cars is a negative externality, right? Cars emit fossil fuels, we all have to breathe it, and now our planet is at stake. This is a negative externality for all of us, even if we're not driving the car. We're trying to apply that same framework to schools and students left behind due to vouchers. So for students who don't take up voucher programs, who stay in public school, they now experience an externality of there being less funding in the public school to support them due to voucher programs. I'm going to talk about, this is a lot of words. I'm sorry. I'm going to just talk about it. So ignore it if you're like looking at the text and you're like, oh my God, that's too much. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this fiscal externality because this is the thing that we are trying to calculate in our most recent report. But the way to think about the fiscal externality of vouchers is to think about public school costs. And so again, why are we doing this? What we're trying to understand is how vouchers undermine the cost for students that are remaining in public school when you sort of see a siphon off of kids taking these vouchers and going to private schools. So the reason that school choice advocates think vouchers just sort of make economic and fiscal sense is that schools generally operate where on a per pupil basis. So you get $10,000 per pupil, or the district gets $10,000 per pupil. When you lose a student, then you lose that per pupil amount. School choice advocates are going to say something like, well, it's based on enrollment, and so when enrollment declines, we have to decline the cost proportionally. However, public schools, like every other economic entity in the modern world, require a mix of inputs, some of which are variable and some are fixed. And so what that means is, regardless of any enrollment changes due to vouchers, some costs are going to have to be paid the same amount. So schools are always going to have to pay their electricity, their heating, their building maintenance, their capital improvements, regardless of how many students are enrolled. These are called fixed costs. Other costs, though, can change with enrollment. This might be instruction, so teachers, or services like pupil services. These are called variable costs. When schools lose revenue due to declining enrollment, and they have a significant share of these fixed costs that can't adjust due to changes in enrollment, problems arise. Fixed costs basically do not automatically fall when student enrollment declines. Districts are then stuck with paying more per pupil for these costs. All the downward adjustment occurs then when enrollment is absorbed by the variable cost. So now districts have less to spend per pupil on anything that could be adjusted. The fiscal externality then is that change in per pupil spending on variable costs that comes from changes in enrollment. I have like two graphs just to illustrate this, and then let's see. Yeah, I have two graphs to illustrate this, and then we'll go to the calculator just so you all can see it. This is just, again, to give you a sense of how this particular cost works. So what I've done here is I've created two situations for a school. I have made up the school district. There are 30,000 students in it in the first year, and after enrollment decline, there's 27,000 students. So this district lost 10% of their students to voucher programs. This is just one hypothetical possibility of how vouchers affect public schools. So, and the bars show the total cost. And so on the left side, you're seeing basically that, pre-vouchers, this school district had around 30,000 students. They had a total expenditures of around 500 million, 250 of which went to fixed costs, things like keeping the heating and electricity on, paying guidance counselors, cafeteria workers, capital improvements, and then another 250 were quote unquote variable. Variable, you could actually argue with me that all school costs are fixed. We need all of these things, right? I'm saying that, again, in this hypothetical school district, about half of the costs could be adjusted due to declines in enrollment. So the idea is if we have 10% fewer students, now we need 10% fewer teachers. That's on the left side, before vouchers. What happens after vouchers is on the right side. And so on the right side, we see that this district has lost around 10% of their students who are now taking up vouchers and entering private school. What can adjust? Well, our fixed costs stay the same. You'll notice that red 250 is the same on the left and the right side. That is both before and after vouchers. there's no way we can adjust certain costs due to declines in enrollment. Put another way, you're always going to have to heat the buildings and keep the lights on. You're always going to have to provide kids food. Those costs just can't adjust. What ends up happening then is the costs that can get adjusted, and this is often instruction supplies, support staff, they have to take up all of the cost of the decline in revenue now going to public schools. And so instruction ends up getting hit more than just that 10% decline. If it was just a 10% decline, variable costs should still be around $225 million, but it's not, because all the money has to go first to pay to these fixed costs. So that difference between 200 and 225, that's what we're measuring with the fiscal externality. It's basically the cost that should be going to students, but that they are missing now due to the high nature of fixed costs in public education from students leaving and taking on voucher programs. This is just an example I made that is the per pupil estimates. It kind of says the same thing. I'm going to skip over it. The punchline here is, again, the graphs will look visually the same. I'm just subbing out the aggregate costs with the per pupil costs. We could say that for $500 million for those 30,000 students, their total costs is going to be the same at 16,000. That's their total per pupil costs. And that same cost is still true after that decline in enrollment, right? They're still paying $16,000 per student. The problem is now we have a greater share going to fixed costs and less going to variable costs. And that difference then is our per pupil externality.
So
a way that I say
quick,
this. Yeah.
Sorry, real quick. There's a question here. Oh, I think it's from Jay again. And he's asking, are state-funded school vouchers uniquely American?
Oh, what a great question. I don't know. That's a fascinating question. I've never thought about it. I should look into it. I will look and I'll get back to you, Jay. Yes,
and then
Roxanne,
I'm sorry, I have one more question. I thought I got all the way up to the top of the chat.
Yeah.
Do voucher programs incentivize private schools to increase their tuition?
They sure do. Good question. I saw a report in Iowa. Yes. And I see that Roxanne asked, can this information affect the charter schools as well? Yes. The way that I came up with these estimates was based on research that has been done on charter schools. So you can use this calculator to think about the cost of students leaving for charter schools or the students leaving for private schools due to vouchers. The crux of the problem is students leaving public education quickly and districts not having time or capacity to adjust to those changes.
I spoke to a superintendent here in Arizona, and he shared with me that after the universal vouchers and so anybody can take it, put it in a private school, micro school, homeschool, whatever. Suddenly the charter schools that were actually, plastering vehicles with flyers and things like that to get people, like at football games or whatever, come to this charter school. Those same schools suddenly were like calling him up and saying, hey man, do you want to problem solve about this voucher problem? And he's like, nah, we've been figuring that out for a while, so you can go ahead and try to figure that out too. But it's
Wow.
like now suddenly they're feeling the crunch that traditional public schools have felt for a long time now.
Yep. Yeah, no, I mean, it is right. All of these are different ways of sort of thinking through alternative education models, when I think sort of at least one of the punchlines we've seen from the data is like the mandate to provide universal education for every single child is like the best dollar for dollar use of government funds in education. It gets one of the biggest returns on investments we can think of. Okay, so thank you for that. I appreciate you flagging the questions. Just a few more minutes, I think. I'll just say kind of quickly what my goal was. So given that I've sort of talked about this fiscal externality and how I think it can be calculated, I wanted to try to calculate it for every single district in the country. And my hope is that, for folks on this call and folks that read the report, I want you to find your district and see what could happen to your district if voucher programs come, for Arizona. They already are there. But what happens if your district loses 5% of its students due to vouchers? And what choices do the schools have to make? In a way, it kind of lets you play principal for a day or superintendent. One thing to flag here is, anyway, this is how I did it. This is the methodology. It's kind of, you can read it in the paper. But I'll show you just an example, and I realize this table is probably even too small to look at, but I wanted to flag that one of the considerations the user has to make when using this tool is that there are three major cost buckets to education. The first is capital. And capital is construction, building operations, utilities, debt repayments. The second category is services. This is transportation, food services, pupil services. So these are our guidance counselors, our bus drivers, our cafeteria workers. And then the final category is probably what we always think of when we think about schools, but it's instruction, teacher salaries, benefits, and supplies. One thing to think about when you're using this calculator is, of these three categories, what share of these category costs can actually adjust to declines in student enrollment? And I'll pull up the calc. So I'm going to stop sharing and reshare a different screen. If you go to, and now I'm going to do something very dangerous, which I'm just going to share my, let's see, where is it? I think this should have it. Okay, so if you go to EPI website, you can click this great big button and download the fiscal externality calculator. When you do that, an Excel file will pop up, and I'm just going to share this Excel file with you really quickly. Here we go. It's a little unwieldy, so I figured I'd walk through it with folks while we're all on the call together. And let's page up to Arizona. So there we go. Right. So if you download the calculator, you'll get an overview page that looks like this and a voucher cost tab that looks like this. If you're like me, you're like, oh my God, these are way too many numbers. That's fair. They are too many numbers. So I'm going to show you kind of the cheat sheet so you know how to use it. Anything that's in light blue will adjust automatically to what you're putting in. So here, the user will decide what is the likely potential enrollment decline due to vouchers in my district. And I'm just going to click Beaver Creek just for now. I'll put it in bold so we can see it. Oh. Is that working? No, it's not. Okay, it might be too much to ask while sharing. So here's Beaver Creek. There are four columns that you as the user need to kind of make a decision about. The first is that enrollment decline. Here I've set all the districts to have a potential enrollment decline of 5%. This could be bigger. You could say 10%. You could say 2%. The second thing to decide is what the adjustment rate is for these three cost categories I was talking about. What the adjustment rate basically says is what share of this cost is fixed and what share is variable. So fixed costs, again, are the things that can't adjust due to changes in enrollment. So in the spreadsheet, I've defaulted that capital costs are always fixed costs. That's a 0. That means, no, you can't adjust due to any changes in enrollment. The lights always have to stay on. We've got to always heat our buildings. Services and instruction are in the middle. Here, I've said that services can actually only a little adjust due to changes in enrollment. By what I mean by that is, like, we need a guidance counselor. We need a nurse. We need our cafeteria. Like, that, the ability of those to actually adjust due to changes in enrollment, to me, feels pretty low. And so I put that number close to zero, but not quite at zero. Where I think most of the adjustment might happen is in instruction, teachers, teaching supplies, teaching salaries. And so that 0.8 is basically saying that 80% of those costs can adjust dollar or percent for percent with changes in enrollment. So if this was at a 1, it would say that we can take off 10% of instruction to reflect the 10% decline in enrollment that we might see. You can pick whatever numbers you want to say is what you think might happen in your district. I've had folks come to me, tell me that the service cost should be much lower or higher, depending on what they think is happening in their district, and that teacher and instruction costs should be lower.
Catherine is asking, and Catherine's actually with Save Our Schools Arizona and does work also with
Hi,
civic
Catherine.
engagement beyond voting. And she's asking, where does administration fall in these calculations?
Services, great question.
Okay.
Great question, Catherine. I'm happy to follow up after with folks that have specific questions about how to apply this for your own district. For whatever reason, this isn't letting me edit. Oh, there we go. Hold on. Let me see. Yeah, I'm not. Oh, okay. Can you still see that Excel file or is it gone? Okay.
We can see it, yeah.
Okay. So I'm just gonna like illustrate. Anytime I change these, you'll see that the entire kind of equation, and I'll just highlight that. There we go. Will change as a result. So here I can start instruction to 0.5. And our fiscal externality keeps changing. You could set this to 10. Fiscal externality will change. So these are totally flexible to whatever the user decides. Key column is the column AE. That is the per pupil net externality due to a 5% loss in students due to voucher programs. Way to interpret this is if the Beaver County, I think I'm still looking at, or if Hope Elementary, sorry, in California, loses 5% of their students due to voucher programs, those students are going to lose an additional $890 in instruction costs or in sort of education costs due to those voucher programs. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I am happy to field and answer any questions for the next 20 minutes. Thank you so much for tuning in and for listening. This is really great.
This tool I love, and I have a feeling that this tool will be used in many Arizona Legislative Committee hearings.
I hope so. That's the hope.
Yeah. Let's see. Kathy is saying charters are funded as public schools and still drain our state resources. So from a cost perspective, they're 100% public. There was a little discussion about what those are. What you said too, and we've always known this. We've always known that when we fully fund schools, and especially schools that are in areas with generational poverty, that will make a huge difference. That's part of the reason why we have Title I funding, is to, provide equity. And now that we're doing away with DEI, which is also, best practices and I'm so glad to see that so many of these corporations are like, nah, our stakeholders or our shareholders are actually like, no, we're going to keep going with this instead of complying in advance. But the thing that's happening here in Arizona, and my question is, does this happen in other states? I'm sure it probably does, is we have this ridiculous thing called letter grade funding, where schools that perform well on a scale of A to F get additional funding. So it further exacerbates. We also have, tax credits where, let's say you have a very wealthy school in North Scottsdale where nearly 100% of the parents provide that, tax credit to their particular, school. It could result in hundreds of thousands of dollars. Whereas where I used to teach in Maryvale, you'd maybe have 4 families who had the cash to be able to do that kind of thing.
Yeah.
do these kind of added measures that reward wealthy schools and punish poor schools, do those happen in other states, or is Arizona unique in that way?
I don't think Arizona is unique, although Arizona is special, to be clear. I think Arizona does face a lot of disproportionate kind of educational inequality policy, right? All of those policies, like you were saying, further educational inequality. And that is the through line with vouchers. What vouchers are ultimately doing is furthering educational inequality by cutting funds from public schools. And let's be real, private schools get to cherry pick who's attending those schools. So not all kids, if kids kind of might want to take that private school funding, if they're not meeting the educational achievement standards of that private school, they're sent right back to public school. So we shouldn't be looking at these sort of failing public schools as a failure. They are under resourced, right? Um, I do think that that sort of either A to F, or I've also heard this as kind of value added teaching, like the way that teachers can, teach to a certain standard, and if their students make the mark, then that teacher stays, and if not, then that teacher goes. All of those types of policies, I think, do happen in other states. Um, Not to the extreme potentially that particular one is happening in Arizona. But inequality policy in education had a big kind of fad trend, I would say, in the 2000s, and we're still trying to walk that back.
Scott was asking, what is the source of the budget data from the spreadsheet that you shared with us?
National Center for Education Statistics. Great question.
Okay.
Yeah, they provide really amazing district level data.
Okay, let's see. Can you speak? This again is from Kathy. Can you speak to the state-by-state transparency of voucher funding and also required curriculum? She says, I believe Arizona is the worst.
Okay, fair. In terms of which one is the worst, Kathy, you would be the expert, not me, on that particular piece. What I can say is the state by state transparency of voucher funding and required curriculum varies. It varies based on um, state special interests. Ultimately, these are tax credits for the wealthy. And so, how the wealthy wants to distribute their tax credits is like going to therefore make some of these decisions. So, they will vary by state. From what I understand with the required curriculum, is that there is very little transparency and accountability of voucher schools. So, Ed Choice, which is a pro school choice organization, has a website and almost like a playbook that they put out to show how to set up a voucher school. And the takeaway from it is just how little qualifications any entity organization needs to set up a voucher quote unquote school. So the required curriculum might be, there might be some basic thing, but my general understanding looking at these state by state transparency and accountability policies is that they are very much the wild, wild west. And the ability to enforce standards is not part of being a voucher school. In fact, the kind of public schools being accountable to the public, so far, these are still the only schools that are accountable to the public, despite these school choice bills.
And that brings up, there is a bill right now, and perhaps Diane will remember the number of it, but I think it's 2191, but it's a bill about allowing for religious, churches, basically, religious organizations to use their property because we have a real housing problem here in Maricopa County and in the entire state of Arizona, but they would allow them to build 40% affordable housing. But the concern there is, like, first of all, how do you enforce that they're not just like using these as little indoctrination centers and forming
Oh, yeah.
micro schools,
Right, right, right,
HB
right. Yeah.
2191. So just so for those of you who are thinking about RTS, last week was crossover week, so just something to think about. And we actually have some Dems that are supporting and even sponsoring that bill. So we want to get in front of that.
Sure.
And
Yeah, 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 yeah.
and I understand. I mean, like, I talked to the sponsor of the bill. I understand where she's coming from, and I know her heart is in the right place. But just
Yeah.
because of our experience with, like Dream City Church or Fresh Start Church in Peoria, these are mega churches who have, who really enjoy profiting. A good friend of mine does taxes, and she, without, divulging private information or anything, she's like, it is amazing how much money goes to these, structured tax organizations, how much people tithe. And, these churches are flush with cash. We don't need to infuse them with more cash. Like,
Right,
at
exactly.
least
Yeah,
I'd
yeah.
like,
That's actually not the place that needs it.
eh,
Yeah.
and it sucks because it's a lot of those smaller, more progressive churches that are already doing a lot of that work in the communities,
Yeah.
and they would benefit from it, and they would do it with the best of intentions to get people into affordable housing. But that's not who's likely to take advantage of these situations. So just something to throw out there for the people here today. Okay, let's see. Um, okay, what proportion of students are going to religious schools? I don't know if you have that data.
I don't have it off the top of my head, but it is a knowable fact. So let me see if I can, let me see if I can take a look at that and I can get back to you, Farrell, if you'd like. Maybe I can just loop through you all at Secular AZ. But that is a knowable fact. It's not a lot. I will say like 90% of students get public education, like receive education through public schools. So 10% are going through private and religious or homeschooling.
And that's another statistic, well, not a statistic, but an anecdotal story I heard from the same superintendent that I was talking about before. He said that it's very common in he calls them cul-de-sac schools, a
Oh,
bunch
wow.
a bunch of young moms who probably started off with like a mom's play group or whatever, they're hearing these stories about, oh, the public schools are failing and I can't send my precious angel there. And he said they hit third grade math third grade math and like sentence structure, and then suddenly they're all coming back to the public
Public
schools,
school. Yeah,
and their kids are so far behind. So there's also that piece of
right.
it, or the, and it's not just micro schools. It could be a charter school, like, oh, I'm angry because something happened and I'm going to pull my kid out. And then the next thing I just saw something recently about a school, a charter school here in Arizona that's going to be closing down sometime this spring, or like they don't and that happened to a friend of mine. This charter school like really seduced this friend of mine. Her daughter and my daughter were on the volleyball team together, and there was like this Christian charter school that really wanted, because she was a very good volleyball player, you know took her out of the school that she'd been in, thought that she'd have a great opportunity, and within a few months the school was closed down. And like,
Yeah. Well, we saw that. Yeah. I mean, that happened. 40% of these schools in Wisconsin, like failed as a result. I mean, they are these sort of underfunded, weird micro schools with no accountability, no transparency. And ultimately, they're not doing the job of educating kids that we're sort of, they're purporting to do.
yeah, this is a good point, Kathy. Some of our good Dems don't seem to see how they're being manipulated. Just ask the Republican sponsor if he'll limit the bill to actual housing and see him refuse. Exactly. Like, we didn't think that our requests were, out of hand or anything like that. It was like, okay, how about all nonprofits? Because the Humanist Society in Greater Phoenix might like to build a tiny home and allow somebody to, live there.
Yeah.
Or from 40% to 80%, you could do that, right? Could you cap it maybe, so smaller churches, those of 1,000 members or less, instead of
Right.
these mega churches who serve tens of thousands of people? So you're right, Kathy. Basically all that to say that you are right. Let's see, Roxanne is saying, didn't AZ used to have a corporate tax that would be used to help underfunded schools? Um, Kathy, you can probably tackle that one. I can't keep track of the funding anymore, to be quite honest, and the sources and the props 123 and the 300s and the yada yadas and the band-aids, because that's all it is. And it's for them, it's like a game, let's see how long we can hold everybody hostage while everybody's waiting to find out if we're going to fund education and how many peanuts are going to be thrown at us this year.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, let's see. So I wanted to ask you, because it has happened here so frequently, do you have any measurable account of how much it costs when charter schools close?
When charter schools close,
Mm-hmm.
no, I'm so sorry, I don't. Yes, you can definitely have the slides though, Dee. Yeah, I haven't looked into charter school opening or closing as it relates. We've really narrowly tried to kind of focus in on these like, totally unaccountable private schools, because in part charter schools They're not in our analysis at all, but charter schools, they just have this throughout the country. They have a very weird, some are publicly funded charter schools, some are like how charter schools fiscally are accounted for in state budgets varies state by state. And so we did not try to look into it at this moment.
Okay, and Kathy says there's a tax deduction you can take for a public school, but it's very minimal, and the tax credit for private schools is several times larger. Again, the disparities. It's just a reflection of what's happening in Washington, D.C. right now, the
Totally,
firing of
totally.
people and just this chaotic, it's meant to destroy. Let's see, what else does she say? That's another state supported private schools that hurts our state revenues. Yeah, I mean, it's a dumpster fire, and it has been for a very long time. And I don't know if you can answer this one because you're the economist, so I don't know if you have a problem solving hat that you can put in. But how do individuals help fund underserved schools?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best okay, so like putting on my economist hat, individuals shouldn't have to, right? It should be the job of the government. That's the whole like we're like the way individuals can do that is by paying their taxes. So probably the best way to think about strong funding for public education would be things like closing tax loopholes. That's certainly not satisfying in this time when we're all itching to do something, which I totally get. I feel that even as I'm in DC, and so I think like one of the ways, this is very silly and just a very personal anecdote. I've been watching Abbott Elementary, which chronicles inner city school in Philadelphia. And which is like gross for me to like do this work and then watch that. I realize that like that's disgusting, but I love it. And individuals chip into local schools all the time, actually. So if it's something you're curious about, I'm sure if you reached out to your local public school, there is a way for you to support them, whether it's through volunteer or providing some scholarship fund or whatever. Those are always possible. That is not a satisfying answer to me as like a public policy expert, and I think in general, what we really want is, strong funding for the government to fund public schools. And especially in the absence of what could be the Department of Education, excuse me, which funds around 15% of all public schools. Figuring out ways and policies that state and localities can make up the difference is going to be really crucial.
Well, and like I said earlier, we do have this tax credit program, and you don't have to donate strictly to the school that's your child's homeschool. You can go to any, so pick a Title I school district, Roosevelt, Isaac School
Yeah.
District, Cartwright, Murphy. I mean, Osborne, Creighton, there's so many of them, especially in Central, South, and West Phoenix. And there's plenty of them in rural spaces where, like you said, these vouchers have really decimated some of these
Right.
areas. And somebody pointed out in the chat that there are legislators who are, it's a huge conflict of interest. Their living room church congregation can start a home, a micro school and benefit from
Yeah.
it. So of course they advocate for it. Let's see. There's another one. Kathy says people love tax cuts and tax deductions, but when you look at it
Right.
from a revenue perspective, they're incredibly harmful. CEBV opposes all deductions because often they're simply ways to deprive the state of revenue. Tax carve-outs in AZ have increased from 12 billion to almost 30 billion in the last 8 years. Kathy's just dropping knowledge here today, I'll tell you what.
Bummer. Yeah. Trying to close this the goal. Seriously.
Yeah. Well, you
Yeah.
mentioned Abbott Elementary, and I love that show. And there's a slightly more like PG-13 public school show right now called English Teacher. Have you watched that one, Hillary?
Oh, okay. No, I have not.
It is on
I'll add it
Hulu,
to my list.
and it's so great because it's a teacher in Austin, Texas, and he's gay, and it's like this, it's basically a satirization of just current events, like
Yeah.
the powder puff football team is going to play and there's a complaint, and so the teacher automatically assumes that it's like these angry Christian parents, but it's actually the LGBTQ plus club, because it's not accurate drag. Like, it's great. It's a good show.
Oh, that's cute. Okay, cool. We'll check it
Yeah.
out.
Yeah. Let's see. The one more coming from Kathy. Let's see. While bonds and overrides are essential now, they do result in huge inequities. Lower income schools can't afford to run them and are needed because the state as a whole refuses to adequately fund all public schools. Also threatening the U.S. Department of Ed impacts over 50% of per student funding in Arizona. So that's, yeah, I feel like we're almost time for the end of the program here. Like, because
Yeah, definitely.
go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's one thing to kind of keep in mind too, as like you go forward, like I think truly, like in addition to like Arizona has a double problem right now. Like Arizona has the problem of mature voucher programs. And I think that can really lead to again, all these concerns about one, what these private schools are doing, two, micro schools, what, like, just the accountability and transparency nature of these schools leads to a decline in education, right? And it leads to like put those kids back in public school, they're going to be behind. And so you have this problem, but you also then have this sort of waning threat of the Department of Ed threatening to cut public schools or cut funding to public schools. And where that ultimately is going to come out is from low income districts. And so low income districts are heavily dependent on federal funding, both for supporting nutrition and basic needs, also for supporting special ed, of which many students who are in low income districts are ultimately going to benefit from. And so this kind of is a 1-2 punch for Arizona, I think, right now, as you all consider the future of public schools.
Mhm. I'm gonna go ahead and say it out loud because Carrie, she posted accidentally to hosts and panelists, but she to everybody, she's saying the PTO or PTA is a great option to help support your local public schools. You can also donate to a particular school for a particular purpose. For example, donate $100 Shadow Mountain for their something being good store, something. Yeah. And honestly, like now too, Deer Valley Unified School District has those Ann E's closets, which are like these boutique kind of stores, where people can walk in and feel like special, and not just like, rummage sale or something like that. They have it set up like an actual boutique. So I don't take anything to Goodwill anymore. I take it to the drop off at 15th Avenue and Beardsley, and everybody else should too, because I'd much rather it go directly to help the people that need it the most than to line the pockets of CEOs and billionaires. That's where I'm feeling today. That's how I'm feeling today. So first of all, there's just nothing but positive comments here. This was a really good discussion. I'm serious. Like, I have a feeling that Kathy's gonna be like just dropping all kinds of data on people as in the coming weeks, and probably sharing this kind of information with legislators that will never listen to her. But it's a good thing to do. So since
We
we're
can
towards
try.
the
We can
end,
always
yeah,
try.
since we're towards the end, I always try to end every one of our Friday discussions, aka Rage Friday, with a little bit of hope. So in this really depressing research, what gives you hope, Hilary?
Oh, meetings like this, I think that like part of the vouchers are old. We've been fighting vouchers as a country for a long time. And I know that that could sound sort of like, oh my God, it feels a little exasperating. It
Mhm.
also to me feels really reassuring because when I think about this fight, it's not a new fight. It's new in its incarnation, but there have been, responsible, thoughtful folks on the ground since the 50s, at least, who have been saying, hey, enough is enough. Public ed is one of the most kind of, one of the most socialist institutions we have, frankly, in a country, like in our country, and one that's worth preserving. The return on investment is huge. It benefits not just those kids, but our society at large. And when people stand to profit, they're going to do a thing or two. And so I think this fight is important and worth having. And I think of myself not as like um, one of 20 people in this fight, but I'm like joining a huge line of advocates and researchers and, speakers and fighters who are all in this and who have been in it for decades. And so all my job is to continue to kind of say my truth and keep passing the torch. And I feel like that's what this work is doing. And I don't know, I think that there's a lot to feel good about in that, as we continue to figure out what the next path is.
Right on. Wow, we've had 2 weeks in a row where I kind of, it's depressing information, but it's also something that, we can use and educate and keep moving forward. And like you said, it's not 20 people, it's more like 20 million people. And
20,000. Yeah. I mean, a lot of
yeah,
people are thinking about this right now, and we can all use each other as resources.
yeah. Well, this has been a great Friday. I appreciate you joining us so much today, Hillary. Here, wait, one last quote because I want to see. The joy of revolution is the privilege of being in the revolution. That is your reward. And with that, folks, have a great weekend.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Hillary.
Thank you for having me. Take care.
Thank you.